Around the beginning of 2018, I spent a lot of time catching up on anime after my semester in Japan because, ironically, I hadn't watched any while I was over there. Two of the big shows that aired while I was away were Made in Abyss and Houseki no Kuni, Land of the Lustrous, both of which have become giant names beloved by anime fans for making waves in the anime industry and are well and alive today. Which is what I'd like to say if Made in Abyss hadn't completely stolen the spotlight. Now, don't get me wrong, I enjoyed Made in Abyss, and it isn't like Land of the Lustrous has completely disappeared, especially considering what it did for the public perception of 3D anime. But personally, between the two of these shows, I found Land of the Lustrous to be superior in just about every way, with pacing being the only aspect where I could agree that it struggled a bit. And yeah, I'm saying that I like Fujisawa Yoshiaki's soundtrack a lot more than Kevin Penkin's. That's not to say that Penkin's was bad, but something about it didn't really resonate with me. I could probably come up with a few reasons for why that is, but explaining might take too long for this video, and having listened all the way through Made in Abyss's soundtrack at least 5 times, I still stand by the fact that Land of the Lustrous is more interesting. Now, if you're already hovering over the dislike button because I don't worship Kevin Penkin, then you're missing the whole point. Land of the Lustrous has a soundtrack that appeals to me similarly to how Evan Call's music for Violet Evergarden does. Both are highly classical in their approach, leaving out the more electronic and modern contemporary sounds in favor of utilizing the natural beauty of the acoustic instruments to their utmost effectiveness. There's nothing wrong with electronics or less conventional sounds, but what I find so surprising is that the only people who seem to realize just how good Land of the Lustrous soundtrack is are other music-minded people. Oh hey, what do you know, other people do talk about soundtracks in video format. There are lots of reviews that just give it the classic, the OST was fitting but didn't stand out much, when in reality this OST is one of the most impressive works I've ever heard for any TV series, anime or otherwise. And there's nothing about it that someone without extensive music training wouldn't understand, because even if I don't consider all of the brilliant compositional aspects, it still just sounds amazing. Now, I could go on and on about this, stating that my word is law because I'm a composer and know everything about music, but I think once you give the music a listen in isolation, you'll start to understand what makes it so good. The first time I became aware of Fujisawa was, oddly enough, from watching Love Live. You know, that tiny series about high school girls singing or something. I'm not particularly fond of the idol songs from Love Live, but one of the first things that I noticed while watching the show was, oh my god, this background music is so much better than the songs we're supposed to be paying attention to. His name popped up a few more times on series like The Eccentric Family and Gate, but it wasn't until Land of the Lustrous that I really started keeping an eye out for his name, which was clearly a good call since he proceeded to blow me away with A Place Further Than the Universe, Review Starlight, and Mushoku Tensei. Listening to the current track, it's quite simple, but serves as the foundation for most of the rest of the soundtrack, giving us a taste of some of the instrumentation as well as the general sound that reflects the atmosphere of the series. The theme opens with a high string drone on G, creating a shimmery effect we can associate with glittering gems. A highly resonant piano then joins in, playing a simple rising and falling melody in C minor, the string drone shifting up to A natural on the final note to outline a C Dorian key. During the pause, we also get a hint of gamelan with a single flourish from what sounds like the gentora or cantil. And full disclosure, I took 3 years of Javanese gamelan in university, but this is Balinese gamelan, so I'm not really familiar with the instruments or structures. The piano can be seen to represent Foss's journey and evolution throughout the show, while the gamelan more directly references the Lunarians. These instruments are also given quite a bit of reverb, creating a resonance that gives the music a sort of wide-open, empty feeling, which draws a connection to the emptiness of the actual world as well as being a more figurative representation of Foss's mental state. The high sparkly notes from the metallophones, strings, and piano's resonant harmonics provide a connection to the idea of jewels and crystals, which fits the narrative given that most of the show's characters are essentially anthropomorphized gems. Like most main theme music, this one plays a simple call and response pattern. The response portion changes slightly in the second repetition of the piano's melody, introducing the horns for a thicker textural sound. This particular melody in the piano is the main motif for the show as a whole, and given how simplistic it is, there are quite a few ways to interpret its meaning. Though rather than musically, I stand by the idea that the highly sparse and reverberant sounds are meant to serve as sonic representations of Foss's mental state and the world the characters inhabit. This brief introduction is followed by a rich chord progression on a string quartet going C minor, B flat over D, E flat. Then A flat major 7, B flat, E flat, F, adding some depth to the sparse melody from before by shifting our tonality between E flat major and C Dorian. The piano plays a few simple flourishes, but continues in the same style, making sure that we are aware that while the world and story are much deeper than what we may have initially believed, as outlined with the string quartet's thick texture, the longing emptiness established in the beginning will continue on. This builds even more as the horns play an additional supporting line and the piccolo plays out some simple arpeggios before reducing the ensemble back down to a sparse cold piano solo to close out the piece. It's such a simple piece of music, and yet there is so much we can understand about the show moving forward from hearing it. The whole piece is quite melancholic, but not necessarily sad, leaning more in the direction of lost and lonesome. Even with the bright sharp 6 from our Dorian scale, the slight hopefulness brought about by it never seems to escape the dramatic heaviness that the sparse piano chords bring about, telling us basically everything we need to know about what we're going to experience without actually telling us anything at all. This is the main theme for the Lunarians, and quickly goes about setting up an otherworldly sound through the heavy use of gamelan. We first hear this near the beginning of the first episode when a black sunspot appears. As the Bodhisattva-like Lunarians begin emerging from the spot, the gamelan begins playing the main melody, almost as if to welcome them in by means of some heavenly procession. And it certainly feels like this as they come parading in on a sparkling black cloud, though the ominous string chords make certain to let us know that these heavenly beings are actually the villains in this situation. Gamelan is often used in film soundtracks to represent ominous otherworldly situations, and is probably the only truly fitting type of music to accompany the Lunarians, given both the fact that they are literally not from the same world as the gems, as well as their appearance resembling Buddhist figures. Ironic that the Buddhist figures are the ones greedily collecting gemstones. What makes the use of gamelan so powerful is that it appears in every track related to the Lunarians, except, ironically, in the track titled Tsukijin, Lunarians. This not only establishes their presence throughout the soundtrack, but also opens the door for more non-Western instruments. As an example, let's listen to another piece that features gamelan but also introduces a new instrument. In contrast to the title of the piece, this track is clearly much darker and more intense than the previous one. Here, the gamelan is playing as a more constant driving ostinato, thundering away while the strings fly up and down to create an air of tension. Almost out of nowhere, the piercing sound of an Indian shenai comes blaring in to steal away our attention. While culturally the music doesn't match the Indonesian gamelan, the shenai still fits with the Lunarians, given that they resemble bodhisattvas and Buddhism originated in India. More importantly though, the shenai gives the listener a musical line to follow, especially following the calm section in the middle of the piece where it comes back in, screaming out a minor 6 that you simply couldn't ignore even if you wanted to. On top of all that, the first time we hear this track in the show is also when a new element is added into the story, that being the relationship between the Lunarians and the sea-dwelling Admirabilis. Shortly after Foss is tricked and kidnapped by Ventricosis, we learn that she did so in order to free her brother Aculeatus. A short scuffle occurs, resulting in Aculeatus falling into the sea, regaining his humanoid form and making quick work of the Lunarians. If we take each element of the music, we can attribute the tense strings and piano to Foss, representing the gems, the continuous gamelan ostinato to the Lunarians, and the piercing Shenai to Aculeatus, representing the Admirabilis. Looking at it from this perspective, it makes perfect sense why all three parts seem to clash with one another at this exact moment in the series. Here we have another world instrument, the Chinese erhu, playing out an extremely emotional melody over the melancholic piano and cello lines. It's easy to hear that in this case, the music has nothing to do with battle or the Lunarians. Rather, this is the character theme for Cinnabar. Due to the nature of how Cinnabar releases mercury from their body, they have been left in isolation so as not to risk hurting the other gems. As a result of being unable to approach or work with the others, Cinnabar is left on the night watch, a pointless duty as the Lunarians only ever appear during the daytime. The erhu not only captures this sense of loneliness and self-hatred through the melody, but also the opposing nature of Cinnabar's character from the rest of the gems, in that Cinnabar can actually function at nighttime and without a partner. The piano serves the same role we talked about before, reflecting Cinnabar's loneliness and self-loathing state of mind throughout the show. While the music fills out texturally with strings and counter melodies between the instruments, it always feels a bit sparse and empty, showing that even despite Foss's efforts to help Cinnabar, there isn't much that Cinnabar believes can be done, no matter how much they secretly hold on to hope. Most of the soundtrack consists of these kinds of self-reflective, melancholic pieces because the story is quite focused on the dark mental states of many of its characters. But that isn't to say that there are no happy tunes or hopeful pieces. In fact, for much of the show's first half, there are quite a few upbeat tracks to follow along with Foss's somewhat carefree way of living. And even the main battle track is a relatively lively piece of music that doesn't carry the same weight that the gamelan pieces do. And in regards to the hopeful tracks, there are two that occur during important parts within the series. We first hear this piece of music when Foss and Ventricosus are discussing what it means to be a proper living being, as the gems cannot technically die as long as enough of their pieces can be put back together. Ventricosus, being one of the only beings in the series that is mortal, teaches Foss a bit about death while also guilting them into bringing her back to the sea so that she does not die of starvation on land. This is one of the major turning points in the story, as it leads Foss into the ocean where they are taught of mankind's history regarding the flesh, bone, and spirit, the three major components that humans split into in order to evolve into the mortal Admirabilis, Undying Gems, and otherworldly Lunarians respectively. More related to Foss, though, this is where they take the initiative to bring Ventricosus into the sea alone, as Ventricosus mentions that she once knew someone much like Foss. Up until this point, Foss has been struggling to come to terms with the fact that they have no purpose in this world, forming a bond with Cinnabar because the two of them share a similar lack of self-worth. Foss believes that if they can find some purpose and perhaps some answers about the world from the sea, then it would make the journey worthwhile, even if doing so goes against the rules. Musically, there isn't a ton to say that isn't super on the nose regarding what makes this hopeful piece work so well with this turning point in Foss' journey towards self-discovery. While the piano melody and harmonies are quite hopeful, they retain the extremely resonant sounds from the more melancholic tracks, which keeps us aware of exactly why Foss is going to these lengths despite the fact that it might now sound hopeful. It also more viscerally represents the idea of being deep underwater, as reverb is a simple trick to create an underwater atmosphere, something I talked about quite extensively for the analysis I did on Nagi no Asukara's sound design. You'll quickly realize that this is the exact same piece of music. However, the main difference between this one and the previous one is the distinct presence of the strings and much less reverberant piano. This makes sense for when this track plays, as it is when the gems are coming out of hibernation in the springtime. only to discover that Foss has made a complete 180 with their entire character. Like before, this is obviously to represent a turning point for Foss, but given that this one is more tied to Awakening and the sea is no longer a focal point for the music, the reverberant piano isn't needed. This also works on a psychological level as well, as Foss has more or less stepped into the role of Antarcticite, thus they no longer have that sense of loneliness and self-hatred from before, at least not in the same way. What this piece doesn't manage to capture is the new burden placed on Foss, both from a working perspective and a psychological one. Of course, we can't necessarily expect this specific piece to show this, as it is simply a repetition of the earlier piece rearranged to fit the current narrative. The bird-like melody on the more prominent violins conjure images of blooming flowers and snow melting under the spring sun. The piano still reminds us that there is some form of melancholy, but its lack of presence gives way to the more immediate notion that Foss has found some sort of purpose, even if it came at a great cost. And the last piece I want to talk about is the complete orchestral overhaul of the opening, Kyomen no Nami. But you'll have to wait until next week for that, as I'll be doing a full in-depth analysis of the opening, as well as taking a look at the changes that were made to make it work with the orchestral style of the show's regular background music. There were actually a ton of tracks in the soundtrack that I wanted to talk about, but just didn't have the time to in this video. Pieces like the regular battle track and a lot of the music in the latter half of the show regarding Foss's mental state after the incident with Antarcticite. I might still save that for a video in the future, so if that's something you guys think you'd like to see, make sure to let me know down in the comment section below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. This is also the kind of thing you can vote for over on my Patreon, so if you want to make sure your request gets heard and help support the channel, make sure to go over there and become a patron. And that's all I've got for today. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.